Okay, hey everybody, welcome to Decoding the Lee Kirby Relationship, a panel for Virtual Comic-Con at Home 2020. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I'm the author of Comic-Con and the Business of Pop Culture. I'm also a writer and sayer of things about comics in the pages of Forbes, ICV2, Publishers Weekly, and places like that. And today we're going to be having a conversation about really what is one of the third rails of comics history. For 50 or more years, fans have, and critics and scholars have been debating over this issue of the relationship between Stanley and Jack Kirby that resulted in the origins of Marvel Comics, the beginning of the Silver Age, and the revolution in comic storytelling that followed and subsequently spilled over into every other media conceivable on the face of the earth. So understanding what made these two tremendous creative talents function in this unique relationship and how comics history and cultural history in general should look back and accord proper credit to each of those guys is a live issue, certainly creatively, also economically. For this conversation, I am joined by four people who have actually researched and written on this issue extensively. So these are not just like fan off-the-cuff opinions. These are based on a lot of research and scholarship, including two recent books about Stan Lee that have come out or that are about to come out, in one case, since Stan left us in 2018, and then also some work on largely on Jack Kirby's contributions over the years as well. So I'm going to let our eminent panelists introduce themselves right now. Let me stop sharing the screen, move to a gallery view. And why don't we start with Abraham Riesman?
Oh, hi. My name is Abraham Riesman. I am a writer based in Brooklyn. I was at New York Magazine for 6.5 years, but then left to write a book, which is a biography of Stan Lee called True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. It's being published by Penguin Random House's Crown imprint, and it will come out on September 29th.
How about Crystal?
Hi, I'm Crystal Skillman. I'm a playwright and screenwriter and author of the play King Kirby, along with co-author Fred Van Lente.
Fred?
Hey, I co-authored this play called King Kirby with my wife, Crystal Skillman, but I also do a lot of work in history in general and comics history, specifically about the comic history of comics, illustrated by Ryan Dunleavy. I've written a lot of Marvel comics, including Amazing Spider-Man and Iron Man and many of the Mans. Yeah, there's more, but I'll plug it later.
And then finally, last but not least, Danny Fingeroth.
Hello, I'm Danny Fingeroth. I was a writer and editor at Marvel for 18 years, ran the Spider-Man line of comics, and worked with a new Stan, worked with him on a lot of projects. More after I left Marvel than when I was there. But my book is A Marvelous Life, the amazing story of Stan Lee that came out in November. And it's generally been reviewed as being pretty objective and even-handed about the relationships between Stan and Jack and Stan and Steve Ditko. I've written a bunch of other books, Superman on the Couch, disguised as Clark Kent, and I'm here to in this noble experiment called Comic-Con at Home. So it should be. I don't know what this is. I'm not actually in Doctor Strange's headquarters, although in case anybody.
What?
I'm actually in Stan's home neighborhood of Washington Heights.
Oh.
But what I'm sort of interested, we're recording this in mid-June and it'll be seen in late July. And I'm just wondering how many different times reality will shift between now and when this comes out, and how things we say will either seem prescient or idiotic. So Anyway, thanks for having me.
And it's frankly, it's just as well that we're recording it in advance, because I think if we were to do this live at Comic-Con, we would need to be behind chicken wire or something. Because this is to say the least a contentious issue, and it's been explored by a lot of people that almost universally have strong opinions on this subject. And at the end, I'd like to sort of tip my hat to some of the other writers and scholars and stuff like that that have shed some light on this. But while I've got you four folks here, let me begin with, I mean, I guess the reason that this fascinates us so much is because the products of the Lee Kirby collaboration are so incredibly engaging and dynamic. And Danny, you were on the ground, you know, like you were part of you read those comics as they were coming out in real time. I guess, why don't I start with you? Just in your impression, how did those comics hit you differently from other stuff that was on the stands? What do you think created this lasting engagement and fascination with the products of Stan and Jack's?
So what you're saying is I'm the oldest one on the panel here. But thank you. Appreciate that.
Age before beauty, sir.
Well, I was a veteran comics reader. I've been reading comics for 3 years, which when you're 8 years old is a long time. So I knew everything about comics. You know, I was the world's foremost authority even then. And, you know, I had an idea of what a comic would be, and I was reading the Superman, Batman stuff. And a friend of mine at school said, there's this new thing called the Fantastic Four you should check out. And I found a copy, and it was issue number 4 with the Submariner, the Return of the Submariner. Even though I'd never heard of the Submariner, I knew that the Submariner coming back was the most important event of my entire life up to that point. And it paid. So that's what Stan and Jack did, was they took elements that were sophisticated for their time, you know, of this brooding character who had been in a Bowery flophouse. I mean, I grew up and lived in Manhattan. I didn't really even know what a Bowery flophouse was, but you know, it brought a kind of grittiness and characters, you know, all the stuff that's now cliche, the characters bickering, you know, Kirby's incredible view of New York. You know, New York is so much a character in those stories, and the combination of what they did with the characters and the dialogue was much different than anything else that had ever come out in superhero comics to that point. And it was, you know, if you were into that, and you know, not everybody was, some people still preferred Superman, Batman. If you were into that and open to that, it just was mind-boggling. And then month after month after month, Marvel would put out this new stuff that just bowled us over. So
Crystal and Fred, I assume that like others of us on this, that we probably necessarily encountered this stuff as reprints first. What was your first experience seeing the original Lee Kirby Silver Age material, and how did it hit you?
My parents got me the original Fantastic Four stuff and the Hulk stuff in like pocketbooks in the 70s, did these color reprints of them. And I definitely devoured them in the Ditko Spider-Man stuff as well. You know, I mean, I've started doing this monthly, semi-monthly like comics column for 13th Dimension, this website. And I was doing the Adam Strange, the Gardner Fox, the DC stuff, just to what Danny said about whether or not people prefer DC and Marvel really hit me, because if you read a DC comic from the early 60s and a Marvel comic from the 60s, early 60s, they look like they come from different planets. Like they're just completely, you know, the Fantastic Four is set in something semi-resembling the real world, and the people kind of talk like real people. The DC stuff, while fun in its own right, is just hammers your head over with plot and weird aliens and insanity. And it's really just two completely different reading experiences, partly because I think a lot of people who drove what's called the Silver Age of comics were holdovers from the Golden Age. Like a lot of the artists and the writers, it's the same people who were making comics in the 40s who continue to make them into the 50s and late 60s. Kirby obviously being one of those people, and Stan to a certain degree also was one of those people, but you know, they took it in a different direction starting in 61. When did you first read it?
Well,
comic?
you know, I was in my Mouse Ghost World, Watchmen world, and then I met someone named Fred Van Lente. We were beginning, you know, so it's really through dating and being together that I first began to be exposed. And I think it was not unsimilar. I kind of took the Fred route of the Jules Pfeiffer collection. So in terms of just getting into the more superhero kind of
That's
world.
an old like golden age.
Yeah, and so
comic, yeah.
and so you know, it was kind of starting there. But I think for me, with this particular story and these particular individuals, Fred has worked through a lot of this story in Comic Book History of Comics, but he started actually by writing a book really about Jack.
That's right.
And so often he would be working on it and be talking about him, and then I was like, that's so amazing. And then I would start to read the comics that he was writing about in that biography, which ended up, a lot of that research ended up more in the comic and the play. So I think I guess I had a true, like, you know, playwrights, very typical playwright kind of thing. Like I got really into the story of the people creating the superhero comics. But in terms of the comic book world, I became fascinated about, and Will Eisner too. I was really, that was the beginning. So I really didn't come in through the superhero genre. I was, you know, all I knew up until then was probably like the Tim Burton kind of stuff. And so getting to then look at the actual comic books, in addition to knowing the people that made them, I just found it incredibly moving and fascinating, particularly how real the characters felt in terms of their everyday life, as well as their superhero achievements in the Jack Kirby Stanley world.
And Abraham, what to you I think is the powerful attraction to those particular comics?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I grew up not really reading Lee Kirby Marvel. I was in, you know, my comics reading boyhood happened in the 90s when we were all convinced that everything that was happening right then was the most important and biggest comics that had ever happened in the history of mankind. So growing up, I didn't have much exposure, but I do remember I think the first Stan Jack comic I ever read was a copy, a really beaten up copy of Fantastic Four number 47, the middle chapter of the Inhuman saga. Well, sort of last chapter, it wraps up in the next issue. That I picked up at Wizard World Chicago in either 98 or 99. I can never remember which year it was.
I was there both years.
Were you?
Ships passing in the night.
That's great. And while I was there, you know, I've written this biography, but I only met Stan in person one time. It was when I was either 12 or 13 and went to Wizard World, got a copy of 47, and stood in line waiting for it to get signed. And he did sign it. And this is a true story, or at least I remember it as a true story. I handed him the comic to sign. He signed it. My mom took out a little disposable camera and took a photo of the two of us. And he looked up at my mom and then looked at me and he said, "You've immortalized me," which, I don't know, maybe I was predicting the future or something. But so I have to say, I didn't really read them in bulk until the omnibus edition started to be available in, you know, not that long ago. And what really, to answer your question, Rob, what makes them magical is this, at least when it comes to, well, when it comes, I'm sorry, if I get long-winded, please feel free to cut me off because I could talk about this all day. But one thing that I find fascinating is, you know, there's the point that was being made earlier about like, oh, well, you know, they talked more like real people, and they did. But what's fascinating is I grew up hearing that lore, and then I read the comics themselves, and I was like, the dialogue's actually very stilted. This is not how, it's closer to how real people talk than how the characters of DC were, for example, prior to that. But what I love is it's not naturalistic dialogue, it's its own thing. It's its own sort of lovely, weird, alliterative, exclamation point filled type of communication that doesn't really exist in prose novels and doesn't exist in conversations you have, doesn't exist in movies. It's its own special type of Stan script. And when it comes to the art, I mean, even a child can look at a Kirby drawing and be completely amazed by it. You don't have to have any refinement to enjoy that stuff, which was kind of the point. It's wonderful populist art. And one thing I always love that doesn't get nearly enough discussion is, Kirby's pencils are amazing, but his collages were also truly fantastic. I love looking at collages that Kirby did. And, that level of artistic experimentation was something that really drew me in once I started actually reading the stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that, these things were fun to read. They were great to look at. They captured imaginations. For myself, I think my first exposure to the real stuff was in a Fantastic Four Treasury edition from the 70s that reprinted the Galactus saga. So like up until that, I'd been reading, actually, I'd seen Kirby's current stuff, and then I saw this, and it's like, I get it. So, and that's widely considered one of the cornerstones of the medium. And it's instantly apparent from their very best stuff what created this sensation, what made millions of people sort of tune into this stuff, and then more importantly, remember it and feel attached to it decades later, such that, when a lot of other stuff that was created around the same time, it was also pretty good, was forgotten. This is the stuff that they're going to making the movies, and it's making all of this money. So I guess, to get to the meat of the topic here, I mean, the big bone of contention is, who created what, who gets credit for these things. And, Stan was with us for much longer. And he had ample opportunity and a great platform to get his version of the story out. Danny, what is Stan's perspective on this? If as somebody that's researched this, what would Stan say to his contributions versus Kirby's contributions to the creation?
What year are we talking about? I mean,
it's an evolving narrative.
Stan's point of view, depending on when you read whatever interview or thing he wrote, was, I think one thing that was consistent is that he always believed, except in the case of Doctor Strange and the Silver Surfer, he always maintained that he came up with at least the initial kernel of the idea, and then and then somehow in some combination with Kirby or with Ditko, then developed those ideas and the visuals and the supporting characters and the backstory. Depending on the era, early on, he would credit Kirby with coming up with almost everything that wasn't in that 2-page springboard for Fantastic Four #1 that he wrote. He would give Kirby credit for doing the lion's share of the plotting, and then and he certainly, one thing Stan again always claimed, and I think was true, was that the dialogue was his, even if Kirby suggested dialogue in the margins and Stan would or would not use some of it. I think Stan saw, whether consciously or not, and I think he was too smart to not have realized it, that the voice telling the stories and the voice writing the dialogue and writing the footnotes was the same voice writing the screaming cover blurbs and writing the letters page answers and writing the bullpen bulletin announcements, and it became this seamless experience of what Marvel was. So it's almost impossible to talk about the creation of the characters without the creation of the entity of Marvel Comics.
Now, Jack Kirby had a different perspective on this, and he became very outspoken about this starting probably in the late 70s and up until his death in 1994, where he made a bunch of claims on his side about his role in creating this. Fred, do you want to speak to Team Jack perspective on this?
Sure. I mean, like Danny said, the story kind of changed, from moment to moment. I mean, Kirby also was somebody who had created a bunch of stuff prior to his work with Stan, specifically Captain America being the most famous one. But he also came with Boy Commanders, he and Joe Simon. And then, later on, he defected, went to DC and did the New Gods characters, Commandy, the Demon, before returning to Marvel. But the way Kirby always talked as if And before sort of the real break with Marvel, because he had a legal problem with Marvel in the mid '80s where he was trying to get his artwork back, and Marvel, in its infinite wisdom, chose to fight him on this. And that's where the relationship really started to go downhill, and that's where he sort of ended up grabbing more and more credit, I think, for himself. But there's a very famous quote, I can't remember off the top of my head where it comes from, but somebody asked him where Captain America came from, and Kirby gave his answer essentially was that it was birthed from America's need to have a super patriot to fight World War II. He talked about this stuff in many ways the same way he wrote and drew, which is very mythically, right? Everything kind of comes out of this, almost collective unconscious, And then in this very famous interview he gave with Gary Groth, where he talked about the birth of the Marvel Universe, was when he walked into the offices and they were carrying the furniture out and Stanley was sitting there weeping. That's kind of, you can even read, because I have the full transcript of the interview in Growth, and the comics is kind of taken aback by it. This kind of comes out of nowhere that this is his claim. He said literally Stan did nothing. And I feel like that was sort of the birth of decades of seeing what Stan was doing and sort of Stan's kind of, self-promotion machine, which is something that he was very good at. And he was kind of trying to emulate that. But unfortunately, every time Kirby tried to emulate Stan, it rarely worked out in his favor. Kirby's response would be either I did it or the universe did it, which seems sort of a very Kirby appropriate way of putting it,
Indeed. So one of the things that's always interested me about this, and besides the the fact that the product of their collaboration was usually so interesting and dynamic, that these were two very different kinds of people, and also that they met under strange circumstances. That Stan was, Martin Goodman, who was the publisher of Marvel, was Stan's
husband-in-law.
Goodman's wife was Stan's cousin or something like that,
Right.
and that's what got him the job. And then when he got to Marvel, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were basically running the place. Simon was the editor-in-chief, and Kirby was the art director. Is that right?
And they were still, a lot of stuff was still being packaged by Funnies Inc. So a lot of it was coming in completed. So it was a hybrid.
So Kirby was in charge, and Stan was kind of the office gopher. And there was a small difference in their ages also that was important in those years. It's like Stan was kind of a teenager. Jack was slightly more established in his I guess early 20s at that time. One of the things that really struck me though, like I was trying to sort of puzzle that out just psychologically, and when I saw Crystal, the King Kirby play that you and Fred did, I think part of your job as a playwright was to get into the psychology of that and sort of unpack that. And I think there was that scene in the beginning of the play really kind of set the stage for your view of that the later complexities that would emerge between these two guys. Can you talk a little bit about like what was your perception of that experience? How did you interpret that, and how did you, I guess, what do you think that meant for their creative partnership?
Well, one of the things just dramatically about their story that's so fascinating, and we always like obviously theater, one of the biggest pieces is things like Amadeus, right? And things like that kind of relationship. But what it really is about is arcs. Fred loves it when I use the word arcs. But these, they have such different roads, and they start in such different places, and they have this fruitful time together, and then they end up in other places than they would expect in many ways. So I think originally I was hearing and reading about that through interviews, and then also the manuscript that Fred was writing about. This image of, I became obsessed with the flute and Stan on the filing cabinet and playing the flute. And this is just the thing, a dramatist's dream. And I was like, oh my God, that has to be in the play. Are you kidding me? This is amazing.
Young Stanley was annoying everybody in the office by playing.
Yeah, it was an ocarina or a recorder. It's various different accounts. But yeah, some kind of woodwind that he drove everyone.
Yes.
Don't forget the propeller beanie.
Oh yes, the propeller beanie too. Yes.
I think it's true. I know we have the line in there, but I think that is true to research, right? That one of the things he offered was like, I can get you guys like milk and saltines. Like I think he literally
Let's see, but that's been for Martin. That's what he did
right.
first.
So it's, you know, I mean,
Boss,
like
yeah,
these
it's one of
things,
his jobs.
you know, and anywhere where we start with an internish like position is really exciting. But also like what was important about the play, and we're still looking for, it's had a few, it hasn't had at least 6 productions and really great reviews, which is great. I mean, and everybody, you know, gets in touch about ideas about it. So I hope that it keeps moving forward. But one of the reasons, one of the things that I think makes the play special is that before you get into that office scene, you really spend time with Jack in the war, and how he starts to, how that affects him in terms of creating character and psychologically, like, and how he's putting that into his work. So by the time he gets into, has this experience, I think we really understand where he's coming from, and we really have this new character coming in. You know,
the war. Kirby was in the war after their initial interaction.
The initial in this particular scene in the office.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood what you were describing.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying chronologically. That's all right.
But so I guess what I'm saying about the play that I think is a little bit of a trick is that you spend time with Jack separately. So by the time the relationship engages, it's really, we really do have the point of view of someone who is a workaholic, has a strong work ethic, works very quickly, and then we have someone who wants to spark ideas.
Well, and you know, you bring up a great point, because the like Danny was saying, the Lee voice permeates all those comics, you know. So
Yes.
we are used to, and I certainly came to Kirby through Lee, right? My introduction to Kirby, you get Lee first, right, and then you find out about this guy Kirby. It's in the reverse in our play, as you point out, is that Lee is a secondary character to Kirby's story. To most people, Kirby is a secondary character in Lee's story. It's sort of
and to me that was one of the most interesting things about the narrative, seeing the play and like realizing that it's like that in the story of Jack Kirby's life, like Stan Lee is like this sort of recurring, you know, almost a foil. But it just, I guess it kind of turned around my view of that when Kirby encounters Stan Lee again in the 1950s, his previous impression was this annoying guy that was related to the boss at this company that I used to work at, that might have even had something to do with him and Simon getting canned at Timely. And now Kirby comes back. And Abraham, why don't you talk about like when they re-encountered each other in the 50s, and also to that scene that Fred alluded to about the story of Stan so-called crying in his office in the different accounts.
Yeah, sure. So correct me if I'm wrong, but Jack had sort of done a little bit of freelance work here and there in around like 56. But had mostly been out of the Timely stable. You know, he was not a recurring, he was certainly not the workhorse that he had once been or would later become. And the transition to that second stage was, you know, it started in what appears to be 1958. It seems that shortly after the death of Stan's collaborator through much of the 50s, Joe Maneely, with whom he did comics and comic strips in the newspaper. Maneely died tragically at a pretty young age, and it seems, according to research that's been done by people who have more experience with publishing history than I do, like going through indica numbers, you know, indices, etc. It seems that in 1958, in June, Maneely dies, and then Kirby shows up at Goodman's offices a couple of days later to get some work. And allegedly, according to Kirby, he walks in and they're moving the furniture out because the business is failing, and Stan is sitting there weeping. And according to Kirby, he then says to Stan, "Don't worry, I'm going to turn the company around. I've got a million ideas. It's all going to be fine." And as you might imagine, Stan did not particularly care for this version of events. And, you know, he did an interview with Roy Thomas, his collaborator, protege, friend, in the much later, decades later, where he talked about like, and Kirby says, Jack says, I I was crying, and I'm not a crier, and they were moving furniture. Well, if they were moving the furniture, it must have been on the weekend, because they would never do that while I was there. And it's this weird moment that Kirby described pretty vividly, but does have there's one big hole in it. And it's not necessarily a hole that discredits it, but it certainly makes you question it, which is that in Kirby's telling, that's when he started brainstorming all the ideas that became the Marvel Universe. And if that's happening in 1958, then it's like, well, why does he then spend 58, 59, 60, and then beginning of 61 doing all of these like sci-fi monster, whatever stories instead of doing those superhero stories? So that doesn't necessarily mean he may have, pushed time together or whatever, but that story certainly was something that was a big bone of contention between the two of them. What exactly happened when Kirby came back to do a lot more work for Goodman in the late 50s?
But sooner or later, it did result in the Fantastic Four and
Right.
subsequently the rest of the Marvel, the sort of avalanche of new characters and new stories and new titles. Danny, do you want to walk us through that period of sort of the early, like the sort of halcyon days of where they could do no wrong from, say, 62 to 65, 66?
Rob, if we could jump in for 5 seconds,
Yes.
just real quick. I'd also like to point out that from Kirby's point of view, he was in a tough spot because he had just sued his DC editor over issues with the comic strip. So in many ways, Stan was in a rough point, right, because his big collaborator died. Kirby was in a rough point because he kind of was blackballed at the main place he was getting work up until the point where he was doing Challenge in Green Arrow and all that stuff.
Yeah,
they're both at low points
Yep.
in their lives.
I think Stan was at less of a low point. I mean, the myth, it's a great myth. The low point for Stan had been like a year or so before. In 57, Goodman changed distribution methods. He had been self-distributing, and he went to a company that turned out to be bankrupt. And then Goodman had to go crawling actually to to the company that a distributor owned in effect by DC Comics, who limited him in his output, both in his magazine line, which of non-comics and in comics, and controlled him. So that crisis happened in 57. By 58, the line was starting to revive again. But Stan, like many people in comics, wanted to get the hell out of comics and spent, he spent a lot of his time in the 40s and 50s and even, up and forever, pitching syndicated strips with various artists, with Vince Colletta, with Neely. And so I think Stan was in a little less desperate position. The company was putting out 8 to 10 comics a month. They were, Stan could assign himself as much freelance work as he wanted, but and I think the critics of comics had moved on to rock and roll. I think the idea of comics were destroying youth had sort of eased up by 58. But you're right, they were putting out these sort of beautifully drawn and kind of lackadaisically plotted science fiction and cowboy, but they were putting out 100 genres. I think that the part that when Stan tells the story that Goodman, one way or another, and why, Goodman was a cagey and smart publisher. He saw the Justice League was doing well at DC, the Justice League of America, and figured a team comic would sell. So, all these stories could be true. Maybe Jack was trying to sell superheroes, but Goodman, it wasn't until he saw the sales of Justice League that he said to Stan, let's pull the trigger and do a superhero book. And then for reasons that are still somewhat vague, unless Abraham's research or Fred and Crystal has turned up something, why Stan didn't just bring together Captain America, Submariner, and Human Torch again, as opposed to coming up with these new characters? Was it Stan was just bored with the old characters, or was it that Jack said, I got these ideas, let's do them? Anyway, so that was the opening gun was Fantastic Four, and I guess it did well. So then there was, I forget the order, Hulk and Ant-Man and Spider-Man. and they all kind of added to the building blocks while they were still putting out Rawhide Kid, Millie the Model, you know, and you know, half a dozen other genres, you know. So it's very, you know, it built, and for some, and for, you know, for Marvel fans of my generation, it was really fascinating and exciting. You know, Stan promoted it in the comics. You'll never believe what the Hulk is. You know, you've never seen anything like Ant-Man. You know, and it was just this kind of carnival barker thing. That was great when you're 10, 12, you know, years old, whatever. And they just built this building and building, and right, and they were firing on all cylinders. And, you know, whether they loved or hated each other, and I think it went through different phases, you know, whatever it was, the combination of the work was to the kids and also to older. You know, I think that it was also a group of college students, young adults, people who would, you know, like Roy Thomas and Jerry Bales, who had read comics in the 40s. Somehow Stan and Jack, but Stan as the outreach person, understood how to appeal to and excite that audience.
One of the difficulties about, you know, actually figuring out what was going on at this time is because of the way that Marvel worked, right, with the Marvel method, where Stan wouldn't write full scripts. He was so busy as the editor, I think, that is pretty well agreed on that he was just kind of spinning off ideas, handing them to the artists. The artists would come back with their pages and everything, and Stan would dialogue the pages. Does anybody have a different understanding of the Marvel method than?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to go first. Yeah.
So I can't.
I think the Marvel method was different every month and every issue. I don't think there was any one Marvel method.
Okay, Fred, you had
Absolutely. It was, the Marvel method is best defined as being, you know, the core definition of it is kind of a loosey-goosey collaboration. You know, you can get into the specifics of what happened in a given issue, but when I say you can get into them, you're not going to get much of anywhere. You can have one of these academic debates that'll often happen on Facebook groups where you go like, well, this one feels like this page was probably more of a Stan page, and this page is more of a Jack page, and it's all just made up. I mean, none of us really know. You know, it's just guesswork. There's no way to really. I mean, you know, you have John Romita Sr. was in the car one time when you know, Stan and Jack were talking out a plot. But that may well have been like them talking about a plot they'd already had a discussion about, and it was, you know, one of them came with the idea and the other just received it, or it could be the exact opposite, whatever.
And I think Romita says, you know, in recounting that particular ride, I think they rode out to Long Island a lot together. Yeah. And he said it was clear they were talking but not listening to each other at all.
Yes. Right.
They were talking but not necessarily listening. To me, the holy grail of comic book research, and if somebody could find these, man, oh man, I think there were some artists, Gene Colan even drew himself doing it in that Daredevil annual, who tape recorded their plot conferences. Yeah. I've never heard of anybody, you know, finding those. I mean, I don't know if they're in, you know, in Gene's archives. I think maybe Don Heck and maybe even Romita did that. Somewhere I'd love to hear one or more of those recordings.
Yeah,
it would be like a Lennon McCartney rehearsal tape from 1963 or something. So they're kind of working out the melody on Help or something. Yeah, yeah, Fred. Yeah.
Well, just what I wanted to jump in was that it sort of shows you how much Stan has defined the Marvel myth. Just because we always phrase it that way. We always say Stan was too busy editing to, you know, hire someone else to write the script because it was too busy. He wanted the paycheck. He wanted the page rate up for the script.
Without discounting that, because it's definitely true, there were times Stan tried other people.
Sure, his brother.
Sure, Larry did the script, but even then,
Jerry Siegel.
Sure.
You would see different credits over the years.
Roy Thomas came in when? 65, something like that?
65.
Before Roy, there were, I think Stan, I think he understood that he were building a brand. And he felt that these other old timers, I mean, part of it, I think, was Goodman was paranoid that if Stan left, who would write these stories? So he kind of was making Stan hire these guys. But
I hear you, because the reason why Marvel bans its editors it's not, editors are not really allowed to script anymore. I think partly because people came to recognize the level of irritation that it builds in it really harms talent relations, right? If
that's another discussion that
it's a different discussion, but
of that system. So this is a whole other.
No, I hear you. But at least when I was at Marvel, editors weren't allowed to write.
Yeah.
Right, but if editors aren't allowed to write, then you'd never have Stanley, Roy Thomas, Jim Shooter, Len Wein, Marvel. You know,
I'm not saying it's necessarily a good or a bad thing.
Sure, but this
I
is
get it. I get
partly why
it's not a good way to run a system. I get it.
Yeah, exactly.
So in the interest
that's why
of
Kirby and Ditko were partly why they were so frustrated.
Right.
so in the interest of respecting Comic-Con's time constraints here, I just want to move on to the last turning point in their relationship.
Now that we solved all the other conflicts.
Yeah, that was so. We can, it's looking like we're going to have a part 2 offline here. But moving on to like the final turning point in their relationship in the mid 60s, whatever they were doing, 64, 65 was getting a lot of attention, right? There's a Fantastic Four, Thor, Spider-Man, all of these things. Of course, Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, Ditko, not Kirby, were starting to get attention outside of comic collecting, outside of the subculture and more into sort of colleges and mainstream media, people kind of taking an interest in what was going on there. And in 1966, I think it was 66, right, that Stan gave a fateful interview to the New York Herald Tribune in which he told his first and in certain ways defining version of what was going on at Marvel. And that had some long-term psychological implications. Let me turn it over to Fred first, and then Fred on the facts of the case, and then Crystal on the possible psychological interpretation of how this may have affected Jack and their relationship, at least the way that you dramatized it in King Kirby.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of speaks directly to what we were shouting about in the previous one, which is that at this point in the late 65, early 66, Steve Ditko, who was doing Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, was the one who was really rubbing him the wrong way, the Marvel method, to the point where, by all accounts, Stan had pretty much ceded over the control of the strip to Steve in order to placate him. But he had this guy come into
Not Friedland.
Friedman.
Friedland.
Thank you. And sit in on one of these plotting sessions where Stan put on a whole show and got up on the table or on the desk or whatever. And they're plotting out what, if I recall correctly, what they're plotting, it sounds like Fantastic Four 55, which is this fight between Silver Surfer and the Thing.
Yeah.
And the guy's interpretation of it, according to Roy Thomas, who was also in the room at the time, Kirby was very much enthusiastically participating in the conversation. But the way the reporter wrote about it in the piece, it made Kirby, and he described Kirby very unattractively, like he was a
short and squat. And
it's like he was the assistant foreman of a
girdle factory.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it just drove Kirby nuts. And Stan's contention, I think, was that, blame the media, am I right? He was like, I was misquoted. They characterized it, they were mean to Jack, but Jack there clearly was something. Jack took it more as sort of the last straw in there. It wasn't really the last straw because he kept working at Marvel for at least another 2 years. But clearly he really held that. He really resented it. Gil Kane talked about going out to lunch with Jack not long thereafter, and Kirby basically wanted to kill him. Like, that's how furious Kirby was.
It was, when Fred had this draft of the scene already, and so really I think I'm just more interpreting what Fred tapped into when he, because we kind of wrote scenes and I kind of shaped things and all these things, but this scene, dramatically, Fred really got spot on. And I think, honey, you put so much of your own experience as a writer and your life into that scene. And it was so powerful because the way the scene is told is that it starts off with this interpretation of Jack working, and this is the way the audience is perceiving it, and Stan is doing all, and it's great because, of course, when actors are embodying things live in front of you, it's just all coming to life. And in the first showing we had in New York, I wasn't sure yet if people who hadn't been following comics would like it as much as those who hadn't. I wasn't sure what the reaction would be, and this scene told me a lot.
And I was sitting in the audience in like one of the fifth or sixth performances, and there was a Kirby partisan sitting in front of me who was like, "This is bullshit."
Yeah,
like,
there was it's
so
causing
furious.
reaction already, but then there's a twist in the scene that Fred really got dramatically so well, where and Jack is literally like processing all this. The actor and then literally goes, yeah, you want to know how it really works? He's like, this is how it works. And then he just illustrates getting a 10-second phone call from Stan. And he's like, oh, could they fight the, I don't know, the silver thing? And could we do this and that, blah, blah, blah. End of story.
They fight God.
You take it, big guy. And then he hangs up. But that doesn't happen to the reversal. So the audience's reactions, and to follow them, whether they were riveted and on the edge of their seat, like what is really happening, the actual interpretation of the journalist, and we've all as artists had moments where either with our collaborators not speaking up for us in the moment. I mean, it's a combination of so many things. It's about how the collaborators see themselves. This is why in theater we have collaboration agreements earlier on, but this is not something by any means that's definable. And also they're creating characters now, like together. And they were such pioneers. Which makes it quite different than the Amadeus story, which is simply about competition. But I do think that I really get the feeling that in terms what Jack was really fighting for is the art is for the idea that the visual medium and that being an artist and telling stories visually is being a writer, and that word of writer and what that means. And it's something we talk about in theater all the time. And we, directors are like, if I see the next production and it looks like what I did here, am I not a part of the writing? Because therefore it is part of the piece. So something we talk about in almost every form. And I think theater really helped nail in this particular instance of the differences of opinion and allow the audience to kind of feel that push-pull, whatever side they were on, yet be accurate to the information, because all we have is the information and how it was perceived and the conflicts it brought up. I do have to say it was hard when Stan passed, and to hear so many people still not know about Jack and his name, and to no disrespect to Stan, but the mythology got so strong about him and their childhood and him being that person that brought them in, and they it's still very much that viewpoint that he was everything. And I think that's because he built a world where he communicated to the audience that he was everything. And
I think that's an excellent pivot to the final, because obviously there's so much more to talk about this. I think we can identify the rancorousness that interview caused as being a turning point that eventually led to Jack and Stan going their separate ways in 1970, or late 69 or whatever was the actual timing of that. And then, only fleetingly working together or encountering each other again for the succeeding decades. And, at first as comics fans, it was a loss, because just even within the world of comics, the collaboration produced some great work and some stuff that really caught our imagination. In the fullness of time, what they ended up creating was billions of dollars worth of intellectual property that has been exploited endlessly. And the questions of creation and ownership, have followed them down through the decades, and, only recently got, resolved in a court case. So that's sort of the larger significance of it. But so I think that the legal issue has largely been settled, at least at that level. Let me ask you guys, as those who have studied this subject, how do you think that history should credit Jack and Stan for their roles in the creation of the characters, the creation of the stories, and then also the creation of the Marvel brand and the atmospherics around that made those stories and characters stuff that we still feel emotionally attached to? Let me start with Danny on this one.
So 25 words or less. The brand, I think, is Stan. I mean, that even people who hate Stan say, well, he did the brand, aside from that, he just picked up a check. I think they were collaborators and co-creators. I think without either of them, and without Ditko, and I think without Martin Goodman, who we haven't spoken about, but I think Goodman was kind of the fourth leg of that stool. I think without any of those people, there's no Marvel universe, and no Marvel phenomenon. So I don't, I can't pretend to give a percentage of who did what. I think these people came together who had very complicated relationships, including, a literal, because Stan was actually related two ways at Marvel. He was also related to Robbie Solomon, that's a whole other panel, but so Stan, I just say they collaborated. I think Mark Evanier says it best, that the Fantastic Four and the other characters were created by Stan and Jack.
Abraham, what's your thoughts?
We run into this real problem here, which is you don't want to end up being King Solomon proposing that we split the baby, because both men, by the end of their lives, their respective lives, were very firm in arguing that they, like each individual was saying I and I alone was the initial progenitor of these characters. And we can't discount the possibility that that Jack really, I'm not saying I argue for this because I do not, there's no smoking gun to be found, I don't think. There's certainly a possibility that these really were just all Jack's characters, that Jack just came up with them and brought them to Stan and said, here's what we're gonna do. I'm not saying that's necessarily what happened, but I get frustrated that Stan's version of the story gets parroted so often without Jack's version ever popping in. And I also get frustrated that people don't want to live with the discomfort of ambiguity. So we sit with now this term co-creator. We say Stan was the co-creator of the Fantastic Four, of whichever character that came out of that collaboration. And I think co-creator is unfortunately a word that we've used to kind of brush aside the controversy, because people love simple answers, and there isn't a simple answer here. We don't have conclusive proof one way or the other. So all I would ask is that people try and live with the confusion, because unfortunately it's what's there, and simple answers are going to leave you far afield from what likely happened.
Let me leave the last word here to collaborators who seem to have a more harmonious creative relationship. Fred and Crystal, what do you guys think?
When we wrote the play, we did, but we made our collaboration agreement, so we had everything.
Creative prenup. Well
our
done.
marriage license is our collaboration agreement. Well, it's funny because I'll in the spirit of doubling down on Abraham's ambiguity, I'll point out that I'm also working on a book in animation. I'm working on a book on role-playing games. And it's not like the Stan-Jack conflict is unique in the history of pop culture. Dungeons & Dragons fans are still fighting over who was more important, Gary Gygax or Dave Arneson. Animation nerds love to point out that the guy who created Mickey Mouse and directed all of his early films was Uberworks, not Walt Disney. And then Uberworks and Walt Disney had a falling out, as did Arneson and Gygax. In all those three cases, you have one individual who's the more creative guy, and then you have the business guy, right? And the bottom line is, in the capitalist society, the business guy wins. You know what I mean? Every time. They're the ones who set the agenda, and they're the ones who create the myth. But without a Gygax, a Disney, or a Lee, within the capitalist society, these are the people who are putting forward the work and selling them and being the face of the company. It's, I think as both Danny and Abraham have pointed out, this is a real chicken or egg type situation. If you separate the two, then you don't have Fantastic Four, number one. You don't have Thor. You don't have the Hulk. They're just different. There's no, alternative history to write. Well, the South won the Civil War. We can sort of speculate about what the ramifications of that are. No, it's like if your parents didn't conceive you and raise you, you would be a different person. You wouldn't exist. It's the same situation here.
I think it's also just the factor that fans of superhero fiction love to have a good guy and a bad guy, and we just gravitate towards stories having to have a hero and a villain, even if the hero and villain are complicated in the Marvel manner. That's
right. Feet of clay.
Feet of clay. Yes, exactly.
Favorite Marvel tagline.
So on that note of understanding, let's bring the conversation part of this to a close here. I want to thank you guys. And as we discussed earlier, I think that we may record a part 2 of this, either within or outside the auspices of Comic-Con, depending on how they'd like to proceed with that, because I think there is some more, again, we've only scratched the surface of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, on this very profound subject that people have written entire books about.
Yeah.
And what I'd also like to do is that we've been lucky enough to have the 4 of you folks as part of this panel. I want to also acknowledge the work of some other scholars that have delved into this. I thought that the John Morrow's book, Stuff Said, from Tomorrow's Press, that collected basically the documentary evidence that exists on the Stan side, the Jack side, all of this stuff in a chronology was a very useful reference. Would have been nice. I invited John on this panel. He couldn't make it, but his book is definitely worth checking out. Everything that Tomorrow's has done to increase our understanding about what's been about the Silver Age and all of that stuff is invaluable. Of course, the first book about Stanley, written by our departed friend Tom Spurgeon and Jordan Raphael in 2004, is still worth a look. There's other people, like the people at the Kirby Museum. The independent scholar Arlen Schumer has quite a bit to say on this subject, and has published about it as well.
It was Arlen I was sitting behind.
I
earlier.
I would have guessed that. I would have guessed that if you hadn't said it.
It was absolutely Arlen Schumer. It was great. But he was like, "What is happening? This play is terrible."
Well,
that's great.
So Arlen has written a thing called the auteur theory of comics that expounds on what Crystal was talking about with the important role of a visual storyteller in the medium of comics. That is, in my opinion, a thoughtful way to approach the subject. But I just wanted to say that we are the first words on this. We're not the last words on it. So I did want to just kind of shout out some of those folks. So where can we find more about you and your works, either current or upcoming? Let me start with Abraham.
AbrahamRiesman.com. I before E. AbrahamRiesman.com.
And when is the book out?
Book is out September 29th. And I will add, to leap back very briefly to the Nat Friedland New York Herald Tribune conversation, I did track down Nat Friedland and I interviewed him at length. So you will have exclusive Nat Friedland content. That's my one thing for like the hardcore comics heads. That's how I'll make them buy the book, is because I talked to Nat Friedland, who I'll tantalize you by pointing out Nat Friedland had no idea about any of this. I was the first person to ever tell him that his article had any impact on anything in the comics world, which I find completely hilarious. But anyway, yes, September 29th, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stanley.
Excellent book. I had the privilege of reading it in proof, and it's
well, thank you. I appreciate it.
So y'all should run out and grab that one. Crystal and Fred, what project are you guys working on these days?
There's a couple things. We've got something we're in the works with us together. But we'll talk about that in a second. I'm the book writer too of a musical called Mary and Max the Musical, and which is based on the claymated film by Adam Elliott. So we've had some showings recently. Something called the pandemic happened, and that complicates theater. So it's definitely in the virtual theater world being talked about.
What's your website?
My website is, thank you, honey. My website is crystalskillman.com. And I think it looks like I'm going to be having an audio drama series coming out this fall that I'm developing. Yeah, it's with Boom Integrated. So we can be on the lookout for that. And I'm in development with the show with the Civilians, which is a theater group.
Good.
Out now is Action Presidents by me and Ryan Dunleavy, my comic book history of comics collaborator, where we take the same irreverent but accurate look to the presidents. And while you're in your bookstores in September getting Abraham and Danny's books, also pick up the Comic Book Story of Basketball by me and Joe Cooper, also from Penguin Random House. So I'm Random House brothers with one of you. I forget which one.
And do you have a website or someplace people keep track?
You can spell my name. That's my website. It's my Twitter handle. It's me on Facebook. It's my Gmail address. It's everything. I'm very
last but certainly not least, Danny Fingeroth.
DannyFingeroth.com, oddly enough, is where to find me. I'm also all over Facebook. That's my main social media thing because I'm old. The book is called A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stanley from St. Martin's Press, Macmillan. It's out in hardcover. The paperback comes out September 1. And there's the audiobook read by me. So if you're enjoying hearing this,
Nice.
just imagine 14 hours of it. And I am, because writing about Lee and Kirby isn't controversial enough, I'm writing a biography of Jack Ruby because I figured there's no controversy about the Kennedy assassination. So I'll just, and Lee and Kirby.
We can do that one next year at the Comic-Con panel. Well, great. Well, thank you to all of the contributors. Once again, I am Rob Salkowitz. You can read my stuff on Forbes, on ICV2, Publishers Weekly, places like that. And you can follow me on Twitter at RobSalk, ROBSALK, where if you can get past the political rantings, the occasional opinions and stuff like that, you can follow the stuff that I'm writing. Thank you guys all. As I said, we will probably do a part 2 of this separately. So thanks everybody. Thanks Comic-Con.
Thanks, this is great. Thanks everybody.
Have a great virtual time with the rest of your convention, I guess.
Stay well.
All right.
Still recording?